Take it, RJ.
Hey, we're back on the air. We're kind of slightly late because all due to my fault. Because Colton was having a debate on geology with Nephilim Free that I was trying to catch as much of as possible and taking notes of, and I'll have to get back to that later. It's a juicy little puppy. And it's actually been a very busy day on things. In the discussion of that, Standing for Truth alerted me to the presence of a response from Matthew Serhati on the reptile-mammal transition that I had criticized him on in our book. He isn't aware of our discussion of it, I don't think, in the rocks, but nonetheless is a little fascinating thing that we'll want to include in volume 2. And we'll put a thing on Evolution Hour in an upcoming one next month where we'll be going into it. Basically, he's doubled down on the argument that there's no connection between the middle ear bones and the matter of the jaw bones. So he's just kind of going,
even though they're the same bones.
Yeah.
That's just pretty stupid.
Just doubling down on it. It's really fun. Anyway,
as Mortimer 81 once said,
I will actually thank Standing. I'll actually thank Standing for Truth for that, because he brought that to my attention. It was from back in October. And unfortunately, I can't comment on it directly there because they shut their comments down after apparently 2 weeks. So it's a frozen bit. Anyway, the advantage of Colton's thing, too, is the fact that Nephilim brought up drop stones. So that's another topic we'll want to make a point of including into volume 2. There is a utility to listening to the claptrap of anti-evolutionists, because they tell you what's important in their argument, or what they think is important in their argument. In the same way, ex-creationists like Colton are useful because they know what it was that was important in their arguments. Whereas people who come from a non-religious background that are just diving into it on our own interest don't have that perspective. So it's an interesting little sidelight. But back to the actual topic of the bloody show, which is the source analysis of Replacing Darwin, the fabulous tome of Nathaniel Jensen. And so far, it's getting off to a slow start. He's got a whole chapter at the moment, which is all on just the basics of genetics and Mendel. Ironically, that some of the things brought up some really old, interesting papers by Sutton from 1903. I think I put a link in about that, and found the Mendel text that was translated by Bateson in 1901, and all sorts of little side details on that. But there was a part that I thought was kind of amusing to show you how Jensen is a little behind on thinking through things. It says, for reasons unknown, Darwin appears to have been unaware of Mendel's work. Conversely, for equally unknown reasons, when Mendel died in 1884, his discoveries died with him, not to be resurrected until the turn of the century. Well, one possibility, that's a half truth.
Yeah.
And the problem is that because he's not a historian, I'm a historian and a writer, and I think of some obvious details. One, Mendel wrote in German. Guess who wasn't fluent in German?
Darwin.
Bingo. And guess what, therefore, was making it more complicated to be able to deal with that kind of thing? Likewise, Mendel was like living in downtown London. No, he's way off in the middle of nowhere doing an obscure little paper that got kind of shunted to the aside. When you understand the history of this, we went into quite a bit of that with some of the stuff in relation to the vestigial organs issue in rocks, as to how many of those things are ones where it's understandable why it was hard to connect the dots in the pre-internet era when you couldn't just email the paper to the scientist.
There is kind of another aspect of it, and that's Darwin. Neither Darwin nor Wallace were mathematicians. So even there, it is possible that Darwin read a sort of summary of Mendel's work, but again, his German wasn't good. Yeah, and also he didn't have the ability to interpret the statistical results that Mendel got for genetics, which is funny because both Darwin and Wallace independently got Mendelian ratios for different traits. Darwin with primroses and Mendel with Wallace with the butterflies.
Yeah. So, Ugly German Truth brings up that, by the way, up to World War I, German was the language of science. Well, probably in certain fields, yes. Although don't tell the French that. So it all depends on the areas, or for that matter, all those English people. There was a much more nationalization quality about things. I would guesstimate that any technical paper that was written in Russia probably would be written in French, not German. And so there's a big mixture of things, but it'd be a fun one to actually look into on that. Now English is the universal science language, and even a lot of technical journals in foreign countries are in English as their primary print media. But anyway, that's aside the thing. So I put in a few little linkages to some of the stuff that not because there was anything inaccurate per se about it, because he's basically repeating the basics of Mendelian genetics, but because they're kind of interesting. And he, along the way, cites a little paper on Mendel's the P in biology prior and after Mendel's discovery by Othnichal. I think I put the link up to that. And also a work on Amora et al. On the number of species that's kind of floated around in the anti-evolution literature for a while, which is a perfectly legitimate discussion and puts you in kind of a benchmark thing. But I don't put it into the misrepresentation category because he's not claiming anything about it that's wrong per se. So I suspect it's going to be a ways down the road until we start getting into the meat of things that we can start checking out that. He's only done a couple technical papers so far that he's even cited, that Mora paper and another one. So he's at the moment 0.5 sources per page in the
0.5. Wow.
Yeah. I'm sure it'll go up, but just exactly how much it goes up is another matter.
What was the other one? It was like one. How many
1.7 for
1.7. Okay.
Yeah, which it stayed pretty stable at that, and it was about 500 sources altogether. We're talking about Rupi and Sanford's book, which is not exactly stupendous. You can divide the math. We've got 4,000 some odd sources over the course of 600 pages. You can divide the math, and
we've still got 8 times as many sources as they do.
Yeah, and I think we deal with them more fairly.
Yeah, we don't quote mine everything.
Yeah, indeed. That'll be a fun little thing. So in this debate that Colton was doing, I had the delight of being able to look at his PowerPoint beforehand. We were up until the wee hours yesterday. And Jackson, you were there, I believe, to take a look at that, I think.
Yeah, we were up late.
Yeah,
and so late. I had to get up early the next day. God,
it was a delightful thing, which is why I wanted to be able to eventually link to it and the various sources involved, but also ferret out where Neffy is getting his source material from, because we know he's a secondary source addict, and although he writes his own material, but he's still relying on people, and you want to find out what that is. So source analysis is absolutely critical in this little area, and I'm sure that. And the Standing for Truth wants to do a debate sometime on endogenous retroviruses. And I said, well, we can discuss ALUs if you like. And I urged him to please write your monograph on how many ALUs Adam and Eve had and Noah and the kids.
Well, because they're both ERVs and ALUs are retro elements. So theoretically, you could bring all the retro elements in and point out, hey, why is 42% of our genome retro elements?
And theoretically, because they're only, Adam and Eve is only living 6,000 years ago and Noah and the kids only 4,300, it should be a snap. To be able to retro-calculate what the initial ALU distribution would have been on them if there were such people and if their model was true.
Right.
So anyway, we'll hope to get on to some other things in due course. I put a kind of an interesting digression that will kind of occupy most of what would be part 2, which is applying source methods outside of just science issues. I happen to be hearing a very interesting article or a discussion on the Reveal Center for Investigative Reporting show that's on NPR. This had been like a couple months ago. And it intrigued me because it was kind of important. It was the accusation that the Trump administration had tried to alter the rulings for what this particular toxic chemical was regulated, and that it looks like it's because a bunch of industry people that make that chemical are writing up the rules. And
Wait, if we just let the foxes in the hen house, they'll order everything amongst themselves.
I decided I would go checking the primary sources on this stuff, and it proved to be a rather interesting trail to look into to verify that, first of all, that the Reveal piece was based upon some fact, and also to find out what the heck was going on, because, I'm an American citizen, you are, we're all here like that. It's like our government, and it's supposed to be serving our interests, and so kind of like find out about that.
Yeah.
So it did, in fact, boil down to an interesting block. I put some linkages up to a lot of the apologetic literature that comes from the chemical industry. And it turns out there's an interesting little point that they tiptoe around. They changed what was to be the defining characteristic of how you determine toxicity. And it was no longer toxicity for things like the threshold for developmental defects. It was the toxicity for affecting the immune system. Well, it happens to be that you have to have much higher dosages to affect the immune system than you do to affect developmental bits.
Well, that's fucked up.
Yeah, so they were arbitrarily picking a higher dosage level that applies to a particular thing and cherry picking what illness they want to talk about.
Whoops.
What fascinated me about this was the double standard, because these birth defects were showing up in military families, and they were having a lot of miscarriages, which brings up the abortion issue. So you would think the people who don't want the babies to die in the womb would be really Johnny on the spot to want to get these chemicals out of the network, especially to protect veterans. So it was just a trifecta of issues that would be hot button issues if they were paying attention to the data without looking at the political context of it. So anyway, I put in a material on trichloroethylene. That's the chemical in question. And there's been a variety of technical work from people on these issues. So I put the linkages up to those papers. And we've got work from Carney and Fisher and Chu. And then there's the mysterious case of the rewritten federal standards, which is that they had been in 2011, the Congress was starting, and lobbyists were trying to downplay this, even during the Obama administration. So they were putting in roadblocks even during that phase. But even so, there was still quite a lot of pushback in the Obama years. That got short-circuited completely in the Trump years, as the reports that were being submitted got edited down to where they replaced them with the new standards, and that just snipping them in and so forth. So it was hard even to find some of the documentation, because for some mysterious reason, the federal government wasn't storing the earlier versions. So anyway, it took a bit to kind of run around some of these things.
That sounds like federal records were not being kept.
Well, or that there's a lot of data suppression going on. And so anyway, it intrigued me because a project down the road of looking into how vaccination and public policies and pollution issues are affected by bad method, just as much as creationists and flat earth are. And that you would apply exactly the same rules on it. But at first, you try to find out whose data field is involved, what sources are relied on. You try to find litmus test issues where you can determine a point at issue. Because if you've got one side saying one thing and another side saying another, and you now have an empirical independent source that establishes that one side is getting their facts wrong, that's relevant. And that's pure source methods. So it was, I apologize for this strange digression into a matter of non-creationist, non-evolution elements, but it does relate to how inevitably politics and all of the things swirling around that interferes with how the science is being done. And it's, I don't know if Mel wants to have a weigh in with some comments on that, because I know that bumps into some of the fields that you've been looking in.
Which portion are you talking about? Because I'm currently fighting with somebody on the internet.
You can go back. It was about trichloroethylene and the federal standards that the Trump administration was downplaying.
Oh, with the hydroxychloroquine? That
Oh no,
was it.
that's in relation to COVID. That's yet another example
Okay.
of
Yeah,
sloppy science. Yeah.
I'll just be frank right now. I'm yelling at a veterinarian on Twitter because he thinks that we need to investigate 5G more because he's like,
Oh.
science got COVID-19 wrong, saying it couldn't be transmitted by
Oh,
cats, and now
dear.
it can. And I'm like,
Yeah.
that is not anywhere the same as 5G towers. What the? And he gave me a review paper for his evidence.
You
on,
get
like,
him, Mel.
three
Get him.
Mutations
studies.
exist.
Yeah, go get him,
Go
Mel.
get him.
Go get
Go
him.
get him.
You may
Get 'em.
return to your filleting.
Get him, kill him, eat him.
Squeal.
And he's like, I'm like, I'm surprised you don't know that the SARS-CoV family is an RNA virus, and there's a paper here about how it's easily transmitted through animals. You're a veterinarian. How did you not know this?
Yeah.
Methinks he's not looking at all the damn data.
So
Yeah.
I'm like,
So Quiz, find out what his source base is. That's source methods at work.
he doesn't have any. He gave me
Oh,
a
I'm
review
shocked.
paper. He gave me
Shocked
a
to
review
hear that.
paper on 3 studies. Look, we need to study 5G more. It's a real problem. I'm like, no, this is a review paper. It's a glorified opinion. There's no evidence here.
Yeah, that's another thing that's very important. You may resume your attack upon the person off on the internet. That issue about once in a while you'll be, or maybe not more than just once in a while, you'll find somebody citing something from a technical journal or medical journal, but when you check, it's not a technical paper, it's an op-ed or it's a letter to the editor. That's a different category. It doesn't mean necessarily it's right or wrong. It just means that that's in a different modality than if it were the peer-reviewed technical paper on a matter of technical fact. In the same way that editorial in Nature magazine is not the same as the technical paper in Nature magazine. So all of this source methods rulings that we're dealing with here can be applied to absolutely anything. And it can be applied to historical analysis when you're trying to work out what was going on during the Whig a political party, as Jackson would be aware of. It's all the same thing.
Well, I would if I read the chapter.
Yeah, well, I come from a historical background. I have a BA in history. I'm not a scientist, but it's still exactly the same source methods. Never confuse a primary and a secondary source. That's the cardinal sin of stupid people, that they can't tell the difference between a primary and a secondary source. They read a snippet of something, like the notorious Darwin quote that Jackson and I keep on bumping into, the I one.
I will fight someone. I will challenge them to a round of fisticuffs if they quote the I thing at me.
Quote. But yet they do it a lot. And although, Lisa for Truth says can't pronounce endogenous. That's probably not the only thing he can't pronounce.
Surprise.
He also can't pronounce evidence.
Yeah,
Imagine
well,
my shock.
I'd be okay with his pronouncing it correctly. I'd just be even more pleased if he ever actually used any of it. Yeah, the medical technology and the toxicity of chemicals is a particularly interesting area because it's very technical. And so now you're looking at like the difference between parts per million and parts per billion and the synergistic effects and how you detect this in sample sizes and how you do control groups. This is serious stuff because anyone can correct me on here if I've gotten a mistake on here, but if you have, for example, a test that is 95% accurate for positive and 95% accurate for detecting a negative, that's actually not a very useful test because it's not nearly accurate enough that you actually, it turns out you're only about, if you get a positive or a negative, you're probably only about like 60% chance that you're actually do have a positive or a negative depending on the thing, because it's that big of a margin for error when it slops in through that. You have to get much closer to like 98, 99% to be able to actually have a useful diagnostic tool. And so now you're knee deep into statistics and all of that stuff. Well, all of these are areas that are just guaranteed to produce a fog bank, where if you are an ideologue and you want to present, there's the old joke about lies, damn lies, and statistics. Well, that's area really comes in.
Yep.
We get this a little, it's far less familiar in an awful lot of the creation evolution issues. You do get statistical analyses when you're looking at radiometric dating and things like that.
Oh, the whole Myers whole proteins can't, or the what is it? The probability of a protein forming under abiotic
Oh yes,
conditions
the random protein fold
is 1 in 10 to the 164th. He made up the number. Anyone who quotes that, he made it up. He based it on literally nothing. So,
Well, I want to say
in principle, those sorts of calculations are junk, because who the hell in the normal abiogenesis field is expecting a giant protein of 200 lengths to just fold up magically like your proverbial tornado generating the 747? No, that's exactly how no evolutionist thinks.
Hold on. I could actually do that,
sideways.
with a sledgehammer, an angle grinder, and an arc welder.
Well,
everybody is talking about really small proteins. Oh, there was a brand new paper that popped out too. I can't remember whether it was in Science or Nature, but apparently some new work on weird little crystalline, not quite amino acids, but that might actually be thought of as potential scaffolding for early biogenesis. And these things can form in space apparently. And they're very unusual little things that no one has really thought of, those sorts of elements in relation to this stuff, so they can form. I suppose it's kind of a counterpart of moralite, except in a crystalline form. And when they said crystal, my God, I was thinking the Andromeda strain.
Although I do have to actually have to put in my input in that the odds of a protein forming magically through spontaneous generation may be this number, but the odds of a protein forming due to chemical reactions based on certain chemicals that are in there become much higher, because it's not spontaneous random chemical combinations that guide chemistry. For instance, For instance, this same guy who says it would be 10 to the 164th would also be saying that, the odds of a molecule of water forming in a mixture of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen when a certain activation energy is applied would be 10 to the 164th power. It can't happen.
Yeah, and look how many water molecules there are in an ocean. So the probability of all those water molecules in the ocean forming spontaneously all at the same time is just incredible.
Yeah, but again, need I remind you, the stoichiometric ratio that I provided, 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen. So the odds of water forming when a certain activation energy is applied in that stoichiometric ratio aren't 1 in 10 to the 164th power. They're 1 in 1 because of the stoichiometric ratio. 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. When a certain activation energy is applied, that chemical reaction always turns out to be some hydrogen, some H.
Well, that's the thing.
Things of H2 or okay.
You have to think, or you have to remember, Meyer. He is not a paleontologist, so why is he writing books about paleontology? He's not a cell biologist, so why is he writing books about cell biology? He's a philosopher. So if he wants to write books about philosophy, go ahead. But stay the frick away from science, because you see, Tornado, his argument is not predicated on literally any chemistry whatsoever. You way overthought it. His argument is the probability he doesn't even give you conditions. He gives you no conditions, nothing. He just says let's assume the probability of a left-handed amino acid is 1 in 2, and and that they form a peptide bond. And so we're going to take this 1 in 2, which we're just assuming, and multiply, and what is it, 150 I think is the protein. So we'll just raise it to the 0.5 to the 150th power. This is potato. This means nothing.
Yeah. The interesting thing is, when you look at actual biogenic research on early life, what they're trying to look at are all those little folds, the little pieces that form these helices and all the rest, to look at what those things do on their own and why they're showing up ubiquitously. One of the things that they've worked why there are gene families is because so many of the things are constructed from the same little bits, and other bits come along, like in the beta globin thing, where it merges with another one to make an even bigger molecule that now does something that the two individual molecules didn't do.
Or same with the hedgehog gene family. It was a fusion of the hedge and hog families, which now does something different, which now, in vertebrates, it patterns our limbs. Well, I think plants have one of them, either hedge or hog, and so you have this. So you had like an early fusion.
Another brand new paper that's popped out. Apparently, there is a little group of animals that don't use homeobox.
Well, actually, you guys are actually forgetting the most important out of all the hedgehog genes, Sonic the Hedgehog.
RJ, what animals are they?
Oh gosh, I don't have it right off the bat.
They
don't use them for patterning genes, I think, for a basal patterning structure. Apparently, it's not.
Well, because you have sponges. Do sponges have them? I know ctenophore. It's like everything from ctenophores up has them, which is why they're the Parahoxozoa. But I don't think sponges have Hox genes.
Here, I'll have to look it up on it. But every once in a while, you get some little things like that, because those are actually revealing as to how it can avoid doing that how it can get to what it does without doing. I think it's a parasitical organism too.
Oh, well, that would also make sense. With no Hox, animals have the same gene. Is this, how recent is this, Arja?
I think it was just like in the last week. So it's brand new paper. It's either in Science or Nature, one of those. I don't think it was in PNAS. Anyway, we won't grind everyone to a halt over that little issue, but I thought it was kind of interesting, and anything that falls into that line. The one area that's the most intriguing for me, that's still haven't worked out all the details yet, is what was going on with, where did the homeobox genes come from? What was the proto-HOX gene system? And that one is probably going to involve another decades of research to be able to furrow through that little bit. Oh, another thing that Standing for Truth was bringing up in the live chat before that debate got started, he was going on about endogenous retroviruses, and he was asking, well, are there any in the Denisovans or the Neanderthals? And
yes.
So I put up a paper, and afterwards he says, well, I was just checking to see if you had the same data.
They're in chimps and gorillas and orangutans and cercopithecus and platyrrhines. They're in all the primates. Good Lord, we have the eutherian mammals have ERVW, which facilitates the development of the wall that protects the fetus.
Now, Standing says he's supposedly considering doing a paper on those ALUs and the ERVs, and I immediately said, "Oh, we would be anxious to see that." I bet you would be anxious to see that too, because then he would have to make a claim and a source, and you would be able to look at the claim and the source instead of the fog bank of video stuff. And I pointed out to him, excuse me, Standing, in the time that you've not done that, Jackson and I have written a whole book. What the hell are you doing?
Try and publish that in an actual fucking journal.
They have no shame.
Instead of a blog post.
These guys have no shame. They're not even Dunning-Kruger poster children. They are the platonic embodiment of the Dunning-Kruger effect.
It's the platonic idoi of Dunning-Kruger. Yes,
these guys are like from the space where the idyllic things are. This is it. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect manifested in human form.
Jackson. SFT and RawMat are just mini Nephilim freeze.
They're even dumber, I think. I think Neff's just crazy. I don't even think he knows what he's talking about. But Standing and RawMat are articulate enough that you can be reasonably sure there's stuff going on between their ears, but it just screws up. Like the video that Ration did, they can't read a graph. These guys can't even read graphs For God's sake.
And that's why putting them onto the non-video context is so extremely relevant. If they can be put into hard copy territory, where now you can slow down and look at the chain of argument and the evidence for it, that's where you either make a case or you jolly well don't. And if you can't pull that thong, Lisa Fortune says her favorite line of Candy is, please explain that for the audience. Yeah. Yes, that's a good giveaway when the person doesn't in fact know it, and so he punts it over to somebody else.
Well, I mean,
or the equivalent of Google it.
It's okay if like, if you're saying it, or it's like the thing that you say, RJ. If we're standing on a beach during the Cambrian, what do you expect to see? Do tell the audience. It can be useful, but I think in Kent's case, it's just. He doesn't know.
If you've got a targeted question of that type, or for the same reason when you were bringing up chromosomes and other things with various debaters, and you suddenly get crickets because they don't really know it outside of the jargon. And that's one of the things to do. If somebody is a jargon addict, that they're trying to wow you with that kind of stuff. But if you can't explain it, I found it was useful, when I would be saying, what the hell's that term, Colton? And he would explain it. And so, because you actually understand it.
No, they can't do that. Standing cannot do that.
Yeah. So anyway, there's the bit about, we're a little bit past the half hour. So let me give some thanks. I must do a double shout out on our patrons, because several of you, Benjamin Simpson and Paul Williams, not only are patrons, they raised their patron up the last bit. And I know how difficult that time has been for people to do that. I was expecting patrons to say, sorry, RJ, but you're not high on my priority list. I have other things to do. And I was fully expecting that, because everybody is in a mess as to try to figure out what they're doing on stuff. So the fact that those two pushed it up, yipes, thank you. Absolutely astonishing. I am most appreciative. So our patrons, we got our colleagues, Hendril, Eric Rowley, and the aforementioned Benjamin Simpson. Speed of Sound, Surus and Zeshi. We got our researchers, Travis and Convert and Eat and James and History Minder and Ralph and Paulogia, and our assistant researchers, Mike and Ian Chen. He pops up in a lot of things. I see him on Dapper Dinos. He's a patron for that too. And he's bought, Ian Chen has bought Evolution Slam Dunk for Dapper. He's sending it to him.
He bought him rocks for there as well.
Yeah. And Doranku and Totes Real, and then our friends Daniel, Steve Bauman, Marigale, Insexus Cool, Devin, Morton Nielsen, Paul the Skeptic, Puffalopagus, Bo, Alex Stone, and Paul Williams, aforementioned. And then our legacy patrons, Jen and Jody and John and Keith and Andrew and Dyer and Yui and Mona and Brad, Daniel, Nanya, Staggle's son, Ugly German Drews, Everett Vincent, and Sur. I know that Dapper says the same thing on his, that he's happy to have people be his patron, but at any point he says, don't give me money if you can't afford to do it. If you have other things you have to make do, and I do exactly the same thing. So I am so uber appreciative of everybody who's not only stuck it out, but even actually pumped it up a tad. Given the economic circumstances, I say I will understand if you have to pull it back. But anyway, thank you very, very, very much on that. And this, I think everybody can fairly say that in this COVID crisis, people are finding out what their true natures are. They're finding out who's a jerk and who is a neat person and who's in between, and we're finding all that out.
Who is really susceptible to 5G conspiracies, which are obviously true, seeing how it's making everybody an idiot.
Yeah. Well, is this like 5G signal that's going? Would be what that is?
No,
I think it's going more like
whoa.
I think it's going more like swoosh, 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 swoosh.
My God,
yes.
I'm just like.
Bing bong.
He's backtracking now. He's like, but I know things now. I know that it could grow in cat cells. We already knew that. I'm like, then that just dismisses your entire argument.
That's the
his whole argument is but my conspiracy, man.
He's a veterinarian.
But my conspiracy.
I want to know where he went to school so I can call them.
Yeah, well, that would be a qualification to be head of HHS in the current administration. So,
oh my God!
I'm trying to think of what the McElroy is a dentist. There was somebody that's a creationist who's a veterinarian that pops up, and my main thing has just escaped me in here. But that pops up every once in a while. You get engineers, that occurs to a certain extent. You get a hell of a lot of biochemists. What is it about biochemistry that seems to cause people to become anti-evolutionists on occasion?
It's certainly not Doc Savage.
Oh God, yes, that was hilarious. Jackson, I have to give you kudos. That was an absolutely entertaining multi-hour discussion.
He had me
that was
rolling.
Quite literally so hilarious.
Yes, Mel, yes, thank you. That it was so much fun. Oh my God. My favorite quote from that whole thing was, "The Swedish chef would make a better president."
Oh yeah.
Okay, just as an aside, he used to do a show with me called Oral Audacity. So
yeah
it's pretty freaking hilarious.
I'd watched it and I'd seen him, and so he commented on Ration's video, and I was like, hey, let's do a chat. And so
yeah, he's pretty cool.
So yeah, it was he really does live up to the moniker.
Oh yeah, Lord. Yeah. He has that. Just think, John Oliver dipped in acid.
He's hilarious. I really enjoyed that conversation.
He's one of my favorite people.
There's a great tradition of that rapier British wit that pops up, and you find it at a kind of more distilled level with Bernard Shaw. But it's a long time. I assume other languages have their own rapier wits in their own context, but I'm familiar particularly with the British. Winston Churchill, he's another rapier wit.
Well, another Brit. So
yeah.
But what was the other thing? Oh, he asked Standing. He said, "I have was it people from the Nobel Committee on speed dial? Do you want me to send them your book?" And Standing said that might not be a good idea. We've
now reached the neat stage where if somebody has their opinions, they can self-publish, they can put it in the case. In the same way that I find those creationist journals that cause some people angst, I find them delightful, because they go, well, we couldn't get this published in the regular science journal, so we're going to write it for our creationist journals. And then you can read them and find out why they can't get them published in the regular
I don't
science
even
journal.
think that they try to get it published in the regular journals
anymore. That's true. Yeah. I think the only one they've known by far enough. You get probably the closest counterpart would be like a Robert Gentry, who was doing the polonium halo material, which there was nothing intrinsically controversial about it, because it was an observation. It's after the point where the antenna went up and they're going, excuse me, he's thinking this shows that these are the created elements at the time of the creation 6,000 years ago. And so he would eventually reach the stage where he couldn't do any new work, because there was no new findings that he was dealing with. It would be that, is he going to make mention of the forbidden thing? And that ain't going to happen.
What is the forbidden thing?
Yeah. I've been having fun following up on the Armitage soft tissue issue and his Triceratops horn.
Oh yeah, I wonder why that couldn't get published in notable paleontological journals.
The only thing that's really come out of this that has surprised me is he is vitriolic.
Oh gosh, yeah. I watched his video last night that Colton linked me to. By the way, what I found immediately curious and suspicious, and Colton confirmed this, is that a whole slew of Armitage's own videos that he's put up, he has taken down.
Of course.
So you can't find them anymore. So this was somebody who had mirrored one of his things that was posted, and he had apparently no control over it. So there it is, like a little iceberg of acid. My gosh, he's an annoying prick.
I'd only seen one thing that, like, one interview he had done, and he seemed normal, and he was just kind of answering some softball questions from a creationist. But I had no idea about, which is bizarre, because you read, critiques on researchers by researchers, and they say, oh, would you consider this and this? And you can see the back and forth. Nobody's vitriolic.
Or certainly not in the name calling silliness stage, which is how Armitage. I mean, he's 8 years old. This is
I
absolutely
wonder why
ridiculous.
he got fired.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there was exactly the same thing with Kopej and the Jet Propulsion Lab, is that if he was even remotely like the way he is in his snarky writings in person, I'm amazed they put up with him as long as they did.
Yeah.
He must have been absolutely insufferable to work with. Or for that matter, can you imagine being a colleague of James Cole? That would be disconcerting.
Speaking of intelligent design, I watched a William Lane Craig video earlier today in which he was talking about the passing of Philip Johnson. I did not know Craig was so pro ID.
It's because he's not young Earth creationist, and everything about Craig's worldview is congenial with the design movement. Their embrace of the Big Bang, for example, that would leave him right off the bat. They just love cuddling up to that singularity and say, "This is God making, let there be light." Isn't that sweet? So everything about the column fine-tuning argument is predicated on the standard physics, the standard models, and so that's all knocked the props out from under him. The funky one is somebody like Hank Hanegraaff, who is simultaneously a young Earth and an old universe creationist.
That's kind of like the that's like the white hole hypothesis or whatever, where it's the universe is old, but we're at like the center of a gravity well, so it's really only been 6 days for us.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of weird kind of ad hoc. Well, for the same reason, Gerald Schroeder and his logarithmic scale version of the creation days to try to get
right.
Which, so long as you just leave out the parts that don't fit, makes perfect sense.
I did have to laugh because at one point, I think it was Craig who said, because it was Craig talking to an interviewer, and one of them said, the ID proponents, what was so tragic about the Dover trial was the ID proponents didn't want ID taught in the schools.
What? No.
Excuse me?
They didn't want it. They didn't want it taught in certain kinds of ways, and they ended up taking that argument because they were getting absolutely nowhere in the courts. Oh, Vesta says, hopefully you are familiar with the Bricklayer's Lament by Gerard Hoffnung. Is that the Hoffnung concerts, Hoffnung? I don't know that I've actually heard that. You have no. I've lost the audience now.
You've lost me.
I think if it's who I'm what I think, the Hoffnung concerts were music parodies that were done back in the mid to late 1950s. They are for, if you're familiar with Spike Jones, or for that matter, more recently, Weird Al Yankovic, that kind of stuff, with classical music. And I'm not sure I've got the Bricklayer's Lament on, because there were some of the concerts that weren't put up. I've got the albums of the ones that were put up on record albums and then later on CD. I'll have to check back on that. Yes, but it's droll. The Grand Overture, which is just a spectacular piece of it. They were all written by actual composers. And one of the Hoffnung concerts, William Walton was called upon to conduct an excerpt from his opera or cantata Belshazzar's Feast. And so he gets up and they go, bum, and then he goes back down. They didn't say how long the excerpt was going to be. And then there's the Concerto Popolare, I think is my all-time favorite. It's the conductor is doing the Tchaikovsky piano concerto, and the pianist is insisting on doing the Grieg piano concerto, and they're at absolute loggerheads all the way through, and you get Roll Out the Barrel and George Gershwin. It's just hilarious, the kind of stuff. And so it's very highbrow comedic thing. Or the Surprise Symphony, Haydn's Surprise Symphony, where there's this bit bum 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 bum. Well, they up the ante with this dun 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 bum. It's just ear-wrenching thing. And then they go through with the bit one where they're actually chasing the tail of the music where it's dun, 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 and part of the violins are coming in the wrong key, so the guy has to up the key to fit, and they continue being so RJ's gone total geek out. Yeah, we've gone total geek out on there. Anyway, back to the alleged subject of the show.
Add cannons to it. It'll make the song better.
Yeah. Avesta says, to scientist Mel, I can imagine that Doc Savage would be a blast to hang out with. I think so, in the same way that an awful lot of people that are good at, they're knowledgeable about a technical field, but they're also personable and chatty. And so they can go on things, and they're not unapproachable.
Oh, he's absolutely lovely. I went and visited him back in October, and we hung out for a while. We had a lot of fun. He says he's savage. He is savage to the morons. He is utterly and completely savage to the morons.
Yeah.
But he is a very genuine guy. He very much wants to help people. And he's just a joy to be around.
Would he be savage to me?
Well, if you're being a moron, he probably would be.
Yeah, in the same way that you want to be kind and gentle to people, but people who are absolutely and willfully stupid, there's nothing in the rule book that says you can't drop a ton of bricks on them.
Yes.
I was right then. Yes, that was referring to Gerard Hoffnung. It was first done at Gerard Hoffnung's 1958 Oxford address that they put that musical bit in on there. Yeah, if you are, because everybody is stuck in social distancing for their lives, that whether the emperor decides to reopen the economy, I don't care. When my governor tells me that the economy can be reopened, then I will think about it.
Right. But yeah, just one more little thing on Doc Savage. He is I don't think people realize. I actually know. I've read his papers. I've seen his resume. He is a leading expert in his field. And so any time you get to learn from him, take that, because
he was they were getting into some geeky discussions on Jackson's show.
They were. I saw quite a bit of it. He's been cited 490 times for his work, just so you know.
Amiga Nuts says, does anyone remember Victor Borge? Oh yeah, I do.
Yeah,
and he'll pop up because he's an old person thing. You'll probably find a ton of it on like pledge breaks on public television stuff.
The whole phonetic punctuation things, like
my super favorite of Victor Borge is some of the stuff that was done on the old albums that don't get cycled into the more recent work of the video stuff that he did. And the all-time roll in the aisle for me is one that is so obscure that probably no one would get it now. It was a parody of the Third Man theme. And if you have no idea what that is, it was Carol Reed's famous movie with Orson Welles from 1947. It's a famous classic of film noir. And it had, the background music was done by Anton Karas on a zither. And it's like, and it's very atmospheric. And that, in the early 1950s, was positively ubiquitous. It was everywhere. And so somebody insisted that requested that Victor Borge play the Third Man theme. And he kind of made a mental face. Okay. And so he sits down and he goes, dun, 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 dun. And he never gets to the bridge. And so he just goes on and on and on until finally the audience realizes he's never getting to the bridge. It's one of the most sublime, viciously ingenious things, just waiting for the audience to catch up. And this thing went on for like 5 minutes before they realized what he was doing.
That is excellent.
We listened to some of his stuff as we drove. Was it to Lake Tahoe? So.
Yeah, you can get it on CD. You can, in fact, a lot of the music parodies. All the comedy albums I have are music parodies. So Spike Jonze, if you want to twist your little mind, go back to Spike Jonze, who is not the director, that a different person. He's from like the 1940s. a totally whacked out guy in a flashy zoot suit, and it would be firing pistols and making gargling and chicken sounds in the middle of the music. It was too corny for sophisticated people, as he says, and too sophisticated for corny people. And he has literally ruined more pieces of music for me. I literally cannot hear them without thinking of the Spike Jonze version. There's parts of Tchaikovsky, there's stuff of Brahms and others where I can't, it has wrecked it for me completely. It's absolutely corrupted my mind. So that's another one in there. Then for another weird one, boy, we're off on a complete digression here. I plead totally guilty.
I have that as well. I can't listen to American Pie anymore without thinking of the Al Yankovic parody.
Yeah, or even not in a comedic context, I can never listen to any Strauss waltz without thinking of orbiting space stations because of the damn 2001: A Space Odyssey. It just has totally ruined it for me.
First world problems.
Exactly. Yes. Iron Charioteer, what's up, heathens? Exclamation mark 1. I don't know. What is up, heathens? Another one that's super obscure, and I think some of her stuff is available on CD, was Anna Russell. That she was an Australian opera singer who went into kind of comedic opera singing. And she did a just ruthlessly perfect 20-minute summary of the Ring of the Nibelungen. That is just a scream where she said, it's this is the first person that Siegfried has ever met who hasn't been his aunt. I'm not making this up, And and then for the ultimate in absolute weird stuff is Jonathan and Darlene Edwards in Paris. Joe Stafford, who was a really great jazz singer, and I don't know whether they were just partners or her husband, but Paul Weston. They did a comedy routine to just crack up their party guests. They played the worst lounge act ever. A singer who's totally tone deaf, can't hold rhythm for anything, a pianist that has way more ambition than they have skill. And it's really hard for great musicians to do bad performance. And so she was just in this, I first heard it when I was in college theater. And at the after party we had after the show, we went out to the director's cabin out in the woods, and where everybody was drinking. I was underage at the time, so I didn't worry about that. But anyway, he would wait till everybody, the students that were in their 20s and stuff, they were all 3 sheets into the wind, and he would put this album on them. And so you hear this April in Paris, and they would, what the hell is that? So, there's nothing wrong with this music. It's perfectly fine. Because they all think, wait a minute, of course it sounds odd. It's deliberately odd. But that one is a real connoisseur. And I can't hear any French songs, April in Paris or I Love Paris in the Springtime, or any of those without thinking of Jonathan and Darlene Edwards. They've absolutely ruined it for me. One more time. Okay, is that a digression or anything?
That was something.
Yeah, but what can you do? We're in a weird situation in here with the COVID crisis, to where we have to social distance, but we can interconnect in media like this. And I can tell you, am I the only one who is really happy that all of the various late night comedians are back on the air from their living rooms and able to make us laugh and think all at the same time? Every one of them now is back up and running. Samantha Bee and
John Oliver was running the whole time, so I don't.
Well, yeah, well he just changed for the one background to another on that. Those Brits are ahead of us on it, but it took a while for a lot of them to come up to speed on it, and I think it's really quite nice, because I was really missing my Colbert.
Oh well. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, Ancha, James could be my uncle any day. Well, yes, I've got nieces and nephews who would kind of agree on that. James is like that one uncle or granduncle you actually look forward to meet during a family event. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, well, I've got actual relatives, and that actually does kind of happen. My niece, her husband, they've been clearing away trees and stuff over at their place in Seattle. And I said, and they weren't sure they were going to be able to get help because the COVID thing was shutting everything down, and the guy they were thinking of hiring was coughing and all this kind of stuff. And I said, I could drive over. and help on that. But she said, nope, you just social distance. I'd love to have me, but can't do that. So anyway, we're all sort of finding out what the heck is going on in here. How many of us have like links up so that we can follow what the maps of expanding death is occurring state by state and nation by nation that we're getting on these?
There's a website called NextStrain, which tracks it all with the phylogeny of the virus, so you can see.
BBC puts up stuff. There's a whole bunch of them. Lisa says, I'd love to have you on my channel. Well, ask away. I'm okay. Anything other than my time on here is pretty much open. And if I know far enough in advance, I can do it either otherwise. Well, we certainly have killed an hour on that, almost kind of on the topics that I was bringing up. Iron Characters, if you check Thunderfoot's video saying the corona unchecked could kill the entire Earth population in 2 months, I don't think that's actually possible because it does have a 2% fatality rate. That
Thunderfoot is he's kind of an interesting one. He's the solar roads guy, isn't he? He's all about like solar roads.
Well, he's also about HAP-B, which was mega busted.
Wasn't he the one that argued with Pothole 54 that caring about forests is pointless?
Did he do that? Jesus.
Oh, gee.
The thing, just as a matter, we'll end on a science note to remind everybody why COVID is dangerous, but why you shouldn't be panicky about it. It's that a coronavirus, its dangerous part was that it was stealthy in that it would not produce immediate symptoms. So that it was passing along without you realizing it, because if you have a disease that's, oddly enough, diseases where the moment you catch them, everyone goes plunk, is not going to survive very well because
look at rabies.
Drops dead. Yeah.
Rabies is a premium example of that. You got a virus that's incredibly, incredibly lethal, but not only is it incredibly lethal, it has a sucky rate of transmission. The only way you could pass it on to someone else is if you get bitten or if they bite you.
And indeed, there's a whole evolutionary subliterature that points out that viruses and bacteria tend to evolve less lethal modalities precisely because being too lethal too fast gets rid of you.
That's what happened with MERS
SARS.
As soon as the current coronavirus is a strain of SARS.
Yeah, SARS I think you had to be right on top of it to actually catch the thing. You had to have physical contact.
But it's like, with MERS and the older strains of SARS, basically, as soon as you got it, you were like experiencing symptoms and people were dying off. And so it was easy to isolate them, and you didn't,
so what you got is a disease that's coming in surreptitiously that has a growth rate that's expanding exponentially, that has a death rate percentage-wise at least an order of magnitude worse than the flu and is easier to catch than the flu. Well, what could go wrong? Well, we've seen what can go wrong.
Donald Trump.
Yes, indeed. I'll end on my usual diatribe with Donald Trump. It would be terribly ironic if Donald Trump ends up finally losing all of his money because of his own stupidity on this matter, to where he's in the hotel business and the hospitality business, and suddenly nobody is staying at his places. And technically he's forbidden to get actual aid money, although his kids can kind of wriggle through. There's apparently a whole bunch of little real estate vultures in the Trump administration that are trying to get what they can through the stuff going on. But anyway, I can't think of anybody in the history of the Republic who has ever been as ill-suited to be president of the United States at a time of crisis like this than Donald Trump. He's far worse than Herbert Hoover was, and he had his problems, but at least he had a cold but caring heart. Trump doesn't even have the caring part. And nothing is more repellent to me as a citizen of the Republic to see his preening and bragging on those 2.5 hour long ego fests because he can't do his rallies. And as you can tell leadership when you see it. And what we're seeing here is somebody who lacks all of that skill set. He doesn't know how to inspire people. He doesn't know how to connect and persuade with people. He doesn't think through things that needed to be done early on. And that was the one where preparation was absolutely everything. So now we're paying the height of it just in a matter of a couple days. We're now up to 28,000 dead. All those people have relatives. Here's one. Imagine if Donald Trump goes to visit the Theodore Roosevelt aircraft carrier. Would anybody object if the sailors in their righteous outrage threw him overboard?
I certainly wouldn't.
I wouldn't be surprised at that at all. So if I were you, Donald Trump, I would steer clear of visiting any aircraft carriers anytime ever.
There's quite a history of mutinies occurring on ships.
Oh, he even brought up Mutiny on the Bounty. I think he has some weird idea of movies. I don't know how many of you have seen the old, the classic Mutiny on the Bounty, the one with Clark Gable and Charles Laughton. That was the biggie, and then it was remade several times, of which they were all not bad remakes, but they were often a little off kilter. But they were all kind of interesting. Anyway, I'm not sure whether any of it's quite sunk in, because Captain Bligh is not exactly a hero in this, and the mutineers are the actual heroes, and so he's got a weird sensibility on almost everything. Don't try to bring up movies around movie buffs, Mr. President. This is not a good idea. So we're a little bit past the hour on this. Ugly German Truth says, should the market smell a drop of blood in the water as he has to sell, he'll never get anything close to the book value of his investments. Oh, I've heard, in fact, that there were some things where Eric was trying to float sale of his Washington hotel, and apparently no one was buying because he was trying to sell it at high market value and nobody wants it. So I'm hoping for the President of the United States to have one final bankruptcy from which he never recovers, at which point all the vultures will come in, and I want him to live as long as Herbert Hoover. I do not wish him to drop dead. No, far to the contrary. I want him to have a long, long, long life of Citizen Kane disintegration down to the end of things. And so on that happy, cheery note, scientists, take us out. And thank you very much for hosting again, dear.
It's my pleasure.
Mel.
Anyway.
Tee-hee.